Hi everybody, I hope you're doing all great. Welcome to my channel and welcome to this new video here. I'm Birgit from Kobasiani. I think you already see it on me. I have a new pattern for you. This is my dress and blouse pattern, Leah. As always, you can get it in all my shops. The links you will find below this video here. So at first, let's talk about the Leah pattern. It comes with a few options. You can just pick whatever you like to make your perfect personal Leah. So at first, we have 3 neckline options. This is the basic round neck. Then we have a round neck with a slit like this here. And we have the neckline view C, which is asymmetric like this here. Then at the waistline, Leah has a lacing option so that you can lace it tight around your body. But the Leah looks also cool with a loose fit like this here. So you can choose to make the lacing and to wear it in a loose way like this. But you can also leave out the lacing at all. I've tried this option on the top length here. And then obviously we have 3 different lengths for the Leah pattern. We have the top length, then the mini dress length like this here. And I'm wearing here the midi length, which covers the knees. Leah is a pattern for medium and light woven fabrics. For example, the midi dress option I've sewn here is out of African wax print, which is a little bit more firm. That means the volume is a little bit more obvious. The top I've sewn in silk, which is very smooth and flowing. So if you choose a fabric like this, silk or viscose perhaps, you will get a nice flowing dress or top. The blue option here is made of a classic shirting poplin with a tiny little bit of elastan. Some other examples from the test sewing phase is, for example, a cotton gaze like this here, which is perfect for the loose fit options. And some testers even tried out a jersey fabric. This looks also quite nice, although the pattern is rather for woven fabrics. I've also kept the size range from my previous pattern, means the Leah pattern is made for bust sizes from 79 cm to 154 cm. Before we start into the sewing project, please don't forget to leave me a thumbs up here on YouTube and subscribe to my channel. But now, enough talked in theory about the Leah pattern. Let's start with this sewing project. Have fun!
For cutting your fabric, it's best to follow the cutting suggestions in the written sewing instruction, because with these I've calculated the fabric consumption. Here in the video I've cut it freehand, but nevertheless there are some things I wanted to show you. At first, there is this little trick for the paper pattern when you'd like to keep it flexible for as many options as possible. For the skirt length, for example, you can just cut in the skirt part once coming from the hem and then fold the lower part away when you'd like to make the mini dress version. But for the top version, this would be too much paper to fold away. Here I actually prepared a separate pattern piece. At the front part, it's no problem at all to fold away the lengths you don't need. To keep this pattern piece flexible for occasions when you don't need the side part or you need the side part, you just cut it in along the line at the center of the dart and then fold the side part behind the pattern piece along the vertical cutting line. By the way, I finally managed to make a general video about my sewing patterns. So for example, when you're not sure about how to handle the DIN A4 or US letter size pattern, you can watch this video, which I've linked for you here. Then of course, the second question, which is important before cutting up your fabric, is if you need any pattern adaptations. As we all know, all bodies are different, and perhaps it can be that you need to adapt the pattern at first to your body shape before cutting up your good fabric. For this topic also, I've made a separate video, which will be linked here. Here at the moment you see me cutting the skirt parts. And for the back skirt, you have to take care that you cut this piece with a fabric fold in the center back for sizes 32 to 40. And from size 42 on upwards, there has to be a seam in the center back. So please use here the pattern piece with the dashed outline at the center back, which includes a seam allowance. By the way, in all my patterns, the seam allowances are normally included. Only here in these clips, you see me adding a seam allowance as I'm working with a prototype pattern. So when you will sew your layer, just cut along the outlines of the paper pattern. You see also here that I folded the fabric horizontally. This means the selvages are on the right and left side, and at the bottom there is the folded edge. But attention, this only works when you don't have a head pattern, means when your pattern doesn't have a direction. In case your pattern, if you have any, has a direction, you have to keep always the same grain line direction. Then follow here the back neck facing and the side parts or side panels. These side parts are only needed when you make a layer with lacing at the side seams. If you're making a loose fit layer, you can skip the side parts. Again, I'm working here with my prototype pattern, but when you're choosing the neckline view C, please put the paper pattern with the lettering facing upwards like this onto the right fabric side. Then the neckline will point to the same direction like my blue dress. The side part at my front part I'm folding away, as here I'd like to sew a layer with lacing. If you're making a loose fit layer, of course the side part of the front pattern piece has to remain untouched. The front and the back parts are, by the way, both cut on fold. This is for all sizes. Next we need some fabric strips, and these are cut without paper pattern pieces. Here I cut some bias tape for the armholes. These tapes should be 3 cm wide. The length depends on your size. Just pause the video to read the exact lengths. The bias tapes can also be in several sections, which can be sewn together later. It's only important that the total length is enough. Bias means it's a 45-degree angle to the grain line, but this hasn't to be 100% perfect. Like you can see it here, I'm measuring and cutting on the go. But if this feels too unsure for you, you can also draw on the strips with a ruler. In the same manner, but with a straight grain line, I'm cutting 4 cm wide strips for the loops and the lacing tape. Just pause again the video to read the exact lengths you need. These fabric strips with a straight grain line can also be cut in several sections and will be sewn together later. This is really perfect to use up the fabric rests. So these were all the pieces which are needed from the main fabric. The front and back facings we also need out of interlining. For the asymmetric facing for neckline view C, it's best you put the facing in the main fabric with its wrong fabric side onto the gluing fabric side of the interlining material and then cut the interlining so you get it in the right direction. For the other facings, for necklines view A and B, that's no problem at all as they are symmetric. Afterwards, only the back neck facing has to be cut out of interlining, and then all cutting work is done. Okay, so here's a short summary about all the pattern pieces. I'll mention them from the left to the right. At first we have the front part, which is cut on fold. Here with the cutout corner at the side seam for a side part with lacing. Then twice as a pair, the side part of course, which you don't need without lacing. And also twice as a pair, the front skirt part. Then at the top you see the front neck facing and the back neck facing, both once in main fabric and once in interlining. If you make pockets, you need the pocket bag 4 times as 2 pairs. By the way, when you're making the top version, the pocket doesn't fit in the side seam, so it's skipped. Then there are the fabric strips for the armhole, the loops and the lacing tape. For the armhole, it's bias cut, and for the other tapes, it's in a straight grain line. Then for the back, we need the back part, also cut once on fold, and the back skirt, which is cut on fold from sizes 32 to 40. and cut twice as a pair from size 42 to size 60. This means in these sizes there will be a seam in the center back. Now we have this preparational chapter before we get to the sewing machine. Please mark these spots on your pattern pieces. I'm starting with all the front pattern pieces. At first you mark the center front at the neckline at the front pattern piece, at the front part, and also all the dart related marks. One of these marks is also at the side part if you have one. By the way, for all marks on fabric edges, I cut tiny V's into the fabric like this. And for all marks within the fabric, like for dart ends, I draw them onto the wrong fabric side through little holes in the paper pattern. The next points we need to mark are the marks A, B and C, which will help you to sew the curve in the dividing seam. Mark A, this is the one at the bottom, is at the same time also a hem mark for the top version. Then the hem is marked, of course, only there where you need it for your length. Please note that the hem mark for the top version at the side seam is at the same time also the upper mark for the pocket. At the side part, please also mark the notches for the loop positions. These are 4 or 3 depending on your size. If you're making the dress version with side seam pockets, please also mark the pocket notches. Let's move now on to the back parts. Here also we need the center back 3 times in total, at the top part, at the neckline and the bottom edge, and also at the top edge of the skirt part. Of course, there we need no notch when you have a seam in the center back at the skirt. Please also mark the sides of the dart at the fabric edge and the end of the dart within the pattern piece. Then there's this cutting line at the back part. Again, this only applies when you're making the lacing. This line you don't have to mark, you just cut it open, like it's stated on the paper pattern. Slightly above this cutting line, there's the notch end of seam, which again you have to mark. This also lies a little bit within the pattern. The loop positions for the lacing are also marked. These notches you can mark on the side of the slit, which lies in direction of the side seam. Like this, they are also drawn in the pattern. Although these are notches at the fabric edge, please don't cut in the fabric here, because later we will sew only with 5 mm seam allowance, so markings with fabric chalk or something similar is safer. Then, like for the front skirt, we need the hem notches and the notches for the pockets if you sew any. At the facings, please mark the center back at the upper edge at the back neck facing. This is here pattern piece number 6. At the front neck facing for neckline A, this is here number 7, we need the center front also at the upper edge. And for the front neckline facing for neckline B, please mark the center front at the upper and the lower edge. For neckline view C, you don't have to mark anything. Then we iron on the interlining to the facings. This is done to the wrong fabric side, which is facing, of course, to the gluing side of the interlining. You better double check this, because otherwise your interlining will stick to something else, but not the facing. Then you lay an old tea towel on top and iron this with medium heat for around 8 to 10 seconds on each spot. Like this, the glue on the interlining melts and the material sticks to the main fabric. Then finally the first sewing step comes. As already mentioned, the fabric strips in bias cut for the armhole and with the straight grain line for the loops and the lacing can be cut in several shorter pieces. It's only important that the total length is enough. So now we will join the ends to reach the needed length. For this, you put the ends together in a right angle with their right fabric sides facing, and then these ends can be joined with a diagonal seam. Afterwards, you cut off this corner, leave only a seam allowance of about 5 mm there, And then you press the seam allowance apart with your fingers or you iron it apart. Like this you join all ends wherever it's necessary. The bias tape is now already ready and can be set apart for later. We are continuing now with the fabric strips for the loops and the lacing. These are now folded lengthwise into the half with the right fabric side to the inside, and they are stitched closed exactly at the center. This means with a seam allowance of 1 centimeter and also with a 1 centimeter distance from the folded edge. If you start this seam not right at the edge, but around 2 centimeter after the edge, it will be easier to turn around the fabric tunnel to its right fabric side afterwards. Then the seam allowance is trimmed to its half, means 5 millimeter. And then at last, the fabric tunnel is turned over to its right fabric side with the help of a safety pin. By the way, if you can get your hands on any vintage safety pins, don't hesitate to do so. They are really incredibly stable in comparison to the modern ones. But of course, there are also special tools to turn over fabric tunnels. So the safety pin I'm guiding through the tunnel until it comes out on the other side again. Then I can pull it until the whole tunnel is turned over. Let's continue now with the front part. At first, we have to cut the front loops. Please cut them off the tape which we've prepared before. We need 8 times a piece of exactly 4.5 centimeter. If you don't make the lacing, of course, you can skip this step. I've added an extra timestamp in this chapter for the point where you can continue. Now, these short tapes are folded into loops and pinned to the side parts to their notches. By the way, each notch marks the center of each loop. The folded side points towards the side seam and all the open fabric edges lay together. As already mentioned, it depends on your size if you're having 4 or 3 loops only. As soon as this is prepared for both side parts, these are now pinned to the front part, of course with the right fabric sides together. Then the side parts are stitched to the front part with, as always, 1 centimeter seam allowance. With this seam also the loops are fixed. It is a little bit tricky to sew this because of the loops. The fabric layers get thick and thin during this seam. Just take your time and help with your fingers to get the thicker layers under the sewing foot. Then I'm overcasting both seam allowances, and here you have 2 possibilities. Either you use your overlock sewing machine or a zigzag stitch like I'm doing it here on the regular household sewing machine. Next we have to cut in the seam allowance at the top end of the seam. Please cut like this almost up to the seam. This makes it possible now to put the seam allowance in direction of the center front, and this is like the seam is pressed now. The loops are still pointing towards the side seam. To finish the seam, it is now stitched down. With this seam, the seam allowance is fixed in its position and the loops get more stability for the traction later. Please stitch here right next to the previous seam line at the side of the seam which lies next to the center front. Afterwards, the chest darts can be done. At first, I'm aligning the 2 marks at the fabric edge at the side seam, and then at the same time, the notch for the dart end within the fabric has to be right at the fabric fold which is created now. Like this, I'm pinning the front parts. If you like to, you can draw on the dart seam line now, but it's also possible to sew this freehand. The dart is now sewn beginning at the side seam and ending at the notch for the dart end within the pattern. Later, the dart is pressed upwards. For the smaller sizes, the dart content fits into the space at the side seam, but especially for the bigger sizes, it's necessary to cut the dart content and only leaving a seam allowance of around 1 centimeter. But whether you leave the dart content or cut it, in any case, it must be overlocked, which I'm doing here with my overlock sewing machine, which means I can cut and sew both at the same time. But of course you can also cut the dart and overlock the seam allowance again with the zigzag stitch. Overlock sewing machine means also now that there is a seam end to secure. The seam end at the dart end is now pulled with a darning needle into the overlock seam. At last, the dart is now pressed with its content or seam allowance upwards. And here I'm only guiding the tip of the iron up to the dart end and not over it to not destroy the 3D shape which is in the garment now. Next we have some more darts in the back parts, the shoulder darts. Again, I'm aligning the notches at the edge of the fabric and I'm making sure that the notch for the end of the dart is on that fabric fold. Of course, again, the wrong fabric side is pointing to the outside here. Like this, I'm pinning the fabric in place for both darts. Then I'm drawing on the dart seam. Again, this is optional. The dart can also be sewn freehand. But if you're a beginner sewist, this helps a lot. The darts are then sewn, like always for darts, beginning at the fabric edge, in a line towards the mark for the end of the dart. Please try to make the angle between the seam and the fabric fold at the dart end as flat as possible. Then the darts are ironed in direction of the center back. Again, I'm taking care that I don't iron flat the 3D shape in the pattern piece, and I guide the tip of my iron only up to the dart end. When the darts are ready, we can move on to the loops for the back part. Again, when you don't plan any lacing, you can skip here this step and directly go on with the next chapter. For the loops, I'm at first cutting pieces from the prepared tape. But attention, this time they should be only 3.5 centimeter long. This is because we will have a narrower seam allowance in the back, and with shorter loop tapes, we will have the exact same outcome as for the front part. Again, we need 6 or 8 loops, depending on your size. The small tapes are now folded in half and pinned as loops to the slit in the back part, more precisely to the notches for the loop positions. The notches mark the center of the loop position. The loops are pointing towards the side seam and all the open fabric edges are aligning. When the loops are pinned in place on both slits, the back part is then folded so that the edges of the slit are aligning and the mark for the end of the seam is on the fabric fold. This is a little bit like for a dart, but this is no real dart. This will only be a seam to hold the loops. This is quickly pinned so that nothing can slip. Then the slit can be closed. Here you should only sew with a seam allowance of around 5 mm. This is really narrow and not even as wide as the half of my sewing foot, at least for my sewing machine. Again, this is a little bit bumpy to sew, like for the side part linking seam in the front part, but when you help with your fingers, this will work. At the end of the slit, please sew in a curve towards the mark for the end of the seam. Of course, the slit edge also has to be overcasted, but this time, as the seam allowance is this narrow, it's really better to use the zigzag stitch of your regular household sewing machine. I've also once tried the overlock sewing machine, but this didn't work well. Then the seam is pressed with the loops pointing to the side seam and the seam allowance pointing to the center back. Unlike for the dart, here you can press everything flat. As a last step here for the back, I'm stitching down the seam allowance just like we've pressed it before. In other words, I'm stitching here through the outer layer and the layers of the seam allowance. And logically, the stitching is on the side of the previous seam, which lies towards the center back. If you have a seam in the center back of your skirt, this has to be closed at first. So the two back skirt parts are put together with their right fabric sides facing. The center back is closed with 1 cm seam allowance as always. The edge is also overcasted and the seam is pressed towards one side. It doesn't matter which one. Then the skirt parts can be attached to the top parts. The skirt parts are gathered to match the width of the top parts. I'm showing you here my favorite method to make gathers, but of course you are free to do this as you like. For the gathering seam, I'm setting the stitch length to maximum, and then I'm sewing along the upper edge of the skirt parts with around 5 mm distance to the edge, and I don't lock the seam beginnings and endings. The thread ends there. I'm letting hang loose and quite long so that I can pull them later easily. At the back part, which I'm doing here, I'm making 2 separate seams, each from the side seam to the center back, because otherwise the gathering seam would be too long, so that the threads could break while gathering the fabric. At the front skirt parts, this gathering seam goes only from the side seam to the notch end of gathering. Then the skirt parts can be ruffled by pulling at one of the threads of the gathering seam. The extra width has to be distributed equally, and the skirt parts are brought to the width of the top parts. Then the top and skirt pattern pieces are pinned together with their right fabric sides facing. And while at the back parts you only have to take care about the center back, seam, end or notches, there are some more notches in the front parts, notch A, B and C, which help you to get the curve right. Please note that notch A is at the same time also the hem notch for the top version. As soon as everything is pinned, the seams can now be closed with 1 cm seam allowance. It's always best to sew with the gathered layer on top. Like this, you can still control the gatherings while sewing and watch over the distribution. It's then still possible to change a little bit the gatherings. You should also make sure that you don't sew in the lowest of the loops. This is what I'm checking here. The curve in the front skirts needs of course also a little bit more attention, but if you sew slowly, this shouldn't be too difficult. Please make sure that there are no pleats in the seam here. Then all the skirt linking seams are overcasted. At last the seams are pressed, with the seam allowance laying upwards. Normally you would say for more obvious ruffles you need to iron the seam allowance downwards, and for less obvious ruffles upwards. So this is a thing that can be seen flexible. But I've noticed that the curve in the front skirt doesn't lay nicely when you press the seam allowance downwards. So this is just where this suggestion comes from. Next, the shoulders are finished. And at first we overcast the shoulder edges in the main fabric and also the shoulder edges on the facings, but here with the lower edge together. I know it's a little bit more work, but I really prefer to overcast the shoulder edges separately and not together, because like this, the shoulder seams are flatter and look also more high quality from the inside. Here you see me overcasting the back neck facing. Then follows the front neck facing. Again, shoulders and lower edge. And of course, at last here also the main fabric layer. Afterwards, front and back parts can be placed together with their right fabric sides facing, both the main fabric layer and the facing layer. The edges can be pinned then, and afterwards be sewn together. Here also with a seam allowance of 1 cm. At last, the shoulder seam allowances are pressed apart, again of course in the facings and the main fabric. The next chapter will be about the neckline. Obviously, we have prepared the facings for the neckline finish, but I just wanted to mention that if you're working with a rather transparent fabric and you don't like the idea of having facings shimmering through the main fabric layer, you can also omit these and make an inside bias binding like it's explained in the chapter for the armholes. Then for necklines B and C, the neckline curve has to be drawn onto the facing. For neckline B, please position the matching template like this, draw on the curve and then flip it over to the other side and draw on the other side of the neckline curve. Please take care to position the template at the lower edge at the notch for the center front. At the top at the center front here, there should be now a gap of around 5 mm. For neckline C, you just pin the template onto the front neck facing and draw on the neckline curve. Of course, the whole drawing takes place on the wrong side of the fabric, means on the interlining. When pinning on the facing of neckline B, please take care that the shoulder seams are aligning and the notches for the center front and the center back. For neckline C, you only have to take care of the shoulder seams and the notch in the center back. As the front is asymmetric, no notch is necessary here. Please don't forget to place also some pins below the curve in the front. Like this, the layers won't slip when sewing. Then the facings can be sewn to the main fabric layer. You just sew all around with a 1 cm seam allowance. For neckline A, you just keep this 1 cm all around. And for neckline B and C, of course, you follow in the front your drawn on neckline curve. Please do this as exactly as you can, especially for neckline B, as this one has to be symmetric. Then the whole neckline seam allowance is trimmed down to 5 mm. The hole in the neckline C here is also cut out, of course, now. At neckline B, you additionally have to trim the seam allowance at the corners at the front, here marked with green arrows, to around only 1 mm, so you almost cut it off. Only like this you get crisp corners, but you really have to pay attention to not cut into the seam or to cut too much fabric so that you will have a hole in your garment later. Additionally, the seam allowance has to be cut in now towards the seam, again up to around 1 mm before the seam. This will help to make the curves smooth. The rule here is to cut more often the steeper the curve is. This means you cut quite often at the sides of the back neckline, because there the curve is a little bit steeper. At the center back, you don't have to cut in very often. Then, of course, a few times along the front neckline for neckline A, but quite often along the special curves for neckline C, what I'm doing here, for example, and again for neckline B, here at the bottom of the curve, here marked with a red arrow. Then you grab a simple wooden spoon, which can be perfectly used to iron the seam allowances apart. Perhaps you are also lucky and have a special tool for this. Be really careful here not to burn your fingers. As soon as the whole neckline seam allowance is ironed apart, the facings can be folded to the inside of the neckline, and the neckline edge is ironed again, with the seam line slightly tilted to the inside. If your neckline curve is not that smooth at the moment, that's probably because you've cut in the seam allowance too less or not near enough to the seam. Means not deep enough. So to remove this problem, just fold everything open again, improve the cuts, and watch how your neckline gets nicer. As soon as you're satisfied with the neckline, you can now top stitch it all around. Of course, the distance to the edge you can choose by yourself. I'm stitching here with a very narrow distance to the edge of around 1 to 2 mm. Another cute thing for the inside workmanship is to fold the lower edge of the facings for around 5 to 7 mm to the wrong fabric side and stitch this. This is nothing that needs pinning or ironing for preparation. You can just do this on the go at the sewing machine. This stitching is done from the right fabric side, as you can see. This is really a quick step, but your garment will look so much nicer from the inside with it. The facings, though, get sometimes a little bit wavy with the step, so I'm quickly ironing the facings again. As a last step for this chapter, the facings are now fixed to the main fabric layer along the shoulder seams. At first I'm pinning this point very exactly, and then I'm placing short seams or bar tacks just in the seam line of the shoulders, and these are sewn from the outside. These seams don't have to be long, just stitch forth and back a few times, and then like this the facings are held in place. As soon as this is done for both shoulders, we can go ahead to the next chapter now. At the side seams, at first all the edges there are overcasted. For the pocket bags, this means this is only the straight edge, the rounded one will be done later. At the front and back, at the waist dividing seam, please take care that the seam allowance is still pointing upwards. Afterwards, the pocket bags can be pinned to the dress. Please make sure that they point in the correct direction, means this rounding should point towards the hem direction. Also, the notches on the pocket bags and the dress are all aligning. As soon as all 4 pocket bags are pinned, they can be sewn on. As always, this is sewn with 1 cm seam allowance, but please make sure to only sew from notch to notch. This means at the top and at the bottom, 1 cm fabric of the pocket bags hangs loosely. Afterwards, the seam allowances are pressed apart, and then the pocket bags are folded to the inside of the dress, and the edge is again pressed. Here, again, the seam line should be tilted slightly towards the inside. Afterwards, the side seams below and above the pockets are done. At first, I'm pinning them, and in the pocket area, I'm making sure that the pockets are not in the way and that the pocket notches at the side seam are aligning. The front and back waist seams also have to be aligned. When closing the 2 side seam sections, it's best to start both seams at the pockets. Like this seam can start exactly at the notch and the area is still like pinned and hasn't slipped yet. Here I'm sewing the upper part of the side seam. I've started the seam at the pocket notch and then I'm sewing upwards over the waist seam to the armhole. Next comes the lower part of the side seam and again I'm starting the seam exactly at the pocket notch. The pocket bags I'm pulling away so that I don't sew over them. The pocket bags have to hang loose at all times. Then I'm sewing downwards to the hem. Afterwards, the side seam allowances are quickly pressed apart. The pocket bags can be closed now too. At first I'm pinning the edges. Then they can be stitched closed. The 1 cm fold on the straight edge of the pocket bags, which comes from the pressing before, can be kept by the way. Of course, the pocket bags are overcasted afterwards also, and if you've used an overlock sewing machine, the ends of the overlock seam are threaded into the seam to secure the seam ends. Then I make sure that the pocket bags lay into the front part and I quickly iron this area again. As a last step, we have to add some small bar tacks at the ends of the pocket so that they don't rip when the dress is worn. For these bar tacks, you just stitch forth and back a few times at the pocket edges with a smaller stitch length. These seams really don't have to be long. You just have to make sure that underneath the top layer, everything is at its place. Means the seam allowances are apart, the pockets are to the front and straight without pleats. As you can see, the bar tacks are done from the outside. For the armholes, we need now the bias tape, which we've prepared before. At first, I'm pinning it all around the armhole edge. Right side to right side, of course, and with the edges aligning. When I've reached the beginning, I'm cutting the bias tape with an overlapping of 3 cm. This is exactly the width of the tape. You can even measure this with the tape itself. Then you pull out some pins to have a better access and join the ends of the bias tape in a 90 degrees angle, right fabric side to right fabric side. Like this, the ends can be joined with a diagonal seam here. This is what you see me doing here. When the ends are joined, the corner here is trimmed to a 5 mm seam allowance, which is then afterwards pressed apart with the finger only. Then the bias tape can be pinned back to the armhole again. Here I'm sewing it to the armhole with a seam allowance of 1 cm. The seam is done, of course, all around the armhole. On both armholes, the bias tape is added. Afterwards, the seam allowances are trimmed to 5 mm to the half, and additionally, they are cut into under the arm, where's this curve. Cut into the seam allowance a few times there, up to around 1 mm before the seam. Of course, you have to take care that you don't cut into the seam. The logic behind this is the same as for the neckline. This is to make the curve under the arm nice and smooth. Now the ironing work has to be done. At first, the seam is ironed so that the seam allowance points to the bias tape. Like this, the armholes are ironed all around. Then the bias tape is folded so that it covers the seam allowance. In this position, it is ironed again. And again, both armholes are treated like this. At last, the bias tape or the edge is folded inwards a second time, so that the tape is now completely at the inside of the dress and is not visible from the outside. Also, the seam line of the linking seam between the dress and the bias tape is slightly tilted to the inside. Like this, it is ironed and then also pinned. The width of this fold over at the inside should be now around 7 to 9 millimeter. But this should come automatically. After preparing both armholes like this, the bias tape can now be stitched in place from the outside of the dress. And if you're now stitching with a distance from the edge of around 5 millimeter, then you easily hit the fold over at the inside, which is, as mentioned, 7 to 9 millimeter wide. For the hem edge is folded at first 1 centimeter, then 2 centimeter towards the wrong fabric side, and it's pressed and pinned like this. When you've prepared the hem like this all around, it's time to stitch it. This can be done from the outside of the dress, but if you think this is too complicated, of course you can also do it from the inside. With finishing the hem, you've already almost made it. This is already the last sewing step. This last chapter is of course optional. If you have planned a lacing for your layer dress, it's now time to thread the prepared tape into the loops. And this is done how you would also thread in a shoelace. Just take care that the ends are at the end, hanging at the bottom. It's not really very visible in the clip here, but I'm using here a safety pin. This helps a bit with the threading process. The ends of the lacing tape I'm just cutting and knotting so that they won't fray. But of course you can also fold the ends twice and stitch them in place. This is up to you.
Yay! We are ready! I hope you've enjoyed the sewing process. As always, if you have any questions or problems, don't hesitate to contact me. You can write me an email to info@koba-siani.com, or you can drop a comment here below this video. I'm always here to help you. And of course, thank you for watching my video. You've made it till the end. I'll be very happy if you leave me a thumbs up here on YouTube. Subscribe to my channel, follow me on social media, and of course, I will be very happy to see you soon again to our next sewing project. Take care until then. Bye!